as the government faces the challenges posed by the pandemic and begins to look towards a long-term recovery where we have a chance to reset the clock and build back better, and we can't go back to the way things were before. That's our really sort of key focus of this conference, and we're delighted that we have an opening address from Eamon Ryan, PG Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications. This is a recorded input as he isn't able to make it to the conference today, but it's really excellent that we have such a comprehensive contribution from the Minister. Many thanks once again to him for contributing, as it really provides a useful introduction for our subsequent discussions, and he provides important information on the Irish policy context. If it's okay, and if everything's in order, I might ask Anya if we could start the Minister pre-record.
I would like to thank Coalition 2030 for the invitation to speak at today's conference on how the Sustainable Development Goals can guide Ireland's recovery. The devastating effects of the COVID pandemic have been felt right across the globe, and during this time we've seen how quickly important gains made in respect of the SDGs have been eroded across all countries. The UN High-Level Political Forum on Agenda 2030 began last week and runs until this Friday. Its focus, like the theme here today, is on looking forward and to the potential for sustainable and resilient recovery from the pandemic. A recovery which brings our economic systems in line with our SDG and climate ambitions. As we look forward, it's essential that we draw on the lessons learned from the pandemic and renew our commitment to the SDGs. The framework provided by these goals will ensure a sustainable, inclusive recovery and an equitable future for all people, especially the most vulnerable. As there is growing optimism that we are finally turning a corner on the COVID pandemic, we're committed to ensuring a balanced and inclusive recovery. And I would like to speak to you briefly today about how our recovery and resilience plans are aimed at promoting our economic recovery and our climate ambition at the same time. The scale of the unemployment challenge following the COVID-19 pandemic will require focused strategies and supports to help people back to work, to training or to education. The Economic Recovery Plan, recently launched by this government, sets out an important roadmap for this sustainable rebuilding and renewal of our economy. It aims to do various things. Firstly, to help people into work by extending labour market supports, such as the Pandemic Unemployment Payment and the Employment Wage Subsidy Scheme, and through activation and reskilling measures. It also aims to rebuild sustainable enterprises through targeted investment and policies that make enterprise more resilient and productive. We also want to ensure that there's a balanced and inclusive recovery through strategic investment, through balanced regional development, and by improving living standards. The overarching ambition of the Economic Recovery Plan is to exceed pre-crisis employment levels by 2024. Crucially, however, these jobs will be more innovative and resilient and in new areas of opportunity, aligned with the government's green and digital ambitions. Aligning with the Economic Recovery Plan and providing significant investment is our National Recovery and Resilience Plan. 3 distinct priorities were identified as part of this plan, including advancing the green transition, accelerating and expanding digital reforms and transformation, and lastly, and just as importantly, providing for social and economic recovery and job creation. Advancing the green transition is key at this juncture. Despite the global slowdown, the climate crisis has not slowed. The global average temperature in 2020 was 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperature levels. This is dangerously close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limitation that we pledged to staying under in signing the Paris Climate Agreement. We are at a critical turning point for climate change, and we need to step up our efforts. The next number of years will be vital if Ireland is to address the climate and biodiversity crisis, which threatens the safe future of the planet. Ireland's ambition is to more than halve carbon emissions over the course of this decade. This will be challenging and will require fundamental change in so many aspects of Irish life. The ambition will be underpinned by the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Bill, which creates an entirely new governance framework for the achievement of climate goals in Ireland. It provides legally binding commitments to cut emissions in half by 2030 and for us to go net zero by 2050. The bill also introduces a system of successive 5-year economy-wide carbon budgets, starting in 2021, and it provides that the first 2 proposed carbon budgets should equate to a total reduction of 51% emissions over the period to 2030. Following on from widespread citizen and stakeholder engagement, Ireland's Climate Action Plan has also been updated. The plan will identify and set out far-reaching policy changes across every sector to deliver the emissions reductions committed to and required, while facilitating at the same time a just transition. It'll be important that the increase in climate ambition is achieved in a manner that balances consideration of fairness, cost effectiveness and solidarity, ensuring that no one is left behind. The government has made progress in developing its approach to this just transition, including considerable research by the National Economic and Social Council on how we can balance the government's response to economic opportunities with the vulnerability that transitions may create for individuals, communities and sectors. A number of interventions, including the establishment of a competitive Just Transition Fund and the appointment of a Just Transition Commissioner, have been made. In addition, the EU Just Transition Fund is also being progressed through the development of the Territorial Just Transition Plan. It will act as a key pillar of the EU Green Deal, and Ireland will be actively engaging with its implementation in the near future. Ireland is also moving into a new phase in relation to our implementation of Agenda 2030. Building on our experience of the first plan, a fundamental objective in developing the second SDG National Implementation Plan is to further integrate the voices of stakeholders. We will be shortly launching a public and stakeholder consultation to inform the development of this next plan. One aspect of the consultation we'll look at is how the supports required by different groups to participate and engage within and with the SDGs. I would encourage you all to have your say and to contribute to the consultation. We are also prioritising the rebuilding and launching of our National SDG Stakeholder Forum and the expansion of our SDG Champions programme. Both were restricted due to the pandemic, and both are important initiatives in facilitating meaningful engagement and determining how the goals can be achieved by and for everyone in society. Recovering from a global pandemic has highlighted that transformative change is possible. Ireland stands ready to build a more prosperous future driven by sustainable and inclusive growth, which leaves no one behind. Thank you.
So first of all, we have Asad Rehman, and Asad is the Executive Director of War on Want. War on Want is a leading NGO which campaigns to fight the causes of poverty and defend human rights as part of a global movement. This includes a focus on a global Green New Deal for people and the planet based on the principles of a just transition and just recovery. We're delighted to have him here today. He's a key organizer of the COP26 coalition and was previously the head of international climate at Friends of the Earth in London, and he's over 25 years of experience in the non-government and charity sector and has served on the boards of several leading NGOs. We also have Paola Simonetti. Paola Simonetti is Deputy Director of Economic and Social Policy Department at the International Trade Union Confederation. She leads trade union engagement on the Sustainable Development Goals, promoting trade union action at national, regional and global levels, including SDG-related policy processes with institutions such as the UN, ILO, G20, OECD and the EU. Prior to this, Paola has worked as a policy advisor on development policy and previously served as head of the European office of CISL, an Italian trade union confederation. Last but definitely not least, we also have Dr. Mike Ryan. Dr. Ryan has joined the group of select Irish people who we can definitely say really need no introduction at this stage. Dr. Ryan is the Executive Director of the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program. He's led the global response to COVID-19 through his work at the WHO and has been at the forefront of managing acute risks to global health for nearly 25 years. He's also been responsible for the health emergencies and response in the WHO for several years, has also worked in conflict-affected countries and has led many responses to high-impact epidemics. So thank you all to our keynote speakers for coming, and I might now ask Asad Rehman if he could kick things off for us.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today. Let me start by saying, last year the Secretary General of the UN stated, COVID is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, and the myth that we're in the same boat. He could have gone on to add that the claim uttered by the richest countries in the world in the midst of the pandemic, that no one is safe until we're all safe, will ring as hollow as the unmet commitments to address the multiple crises facing many in the global south. Be it the response to the COVID pandemic, the ongoing climate crisis, the crisis of economic inequality, and the deliberate impoverishment of so many countries through unjust and unfair neoliberal economic policies, the reality is there continues to be an active denial of that universal truth that everyone has the right to a dignified life. If COVID exposed structural inequalities and injustices in our own societies in the global north, of course it further exposed those between societies in the north and south. Rich countries responded by throwing away the neoliberal economic rulebook that they imposed on others, directly intervening in their economies to safeguard their citizens, whilst denying those very same tools and the financial means for countries in the global south to do the same. And I'm sure Mike will speak about this, and even refusing to act on what is the lowest hanging fruit, that of ensuring vaccines and treatments are available to all, simply to protect the profits of big pharmaceutical companies, let alone reversing the policies that they've imposed that have helped dismantle and privatize so many of the vital public services, such as health, that we've all relied on. If we glance around the world this week, we've witnessed record-breaking temperatures in Pakistan, 1 million people facing famine in Madagascar, a heat wave across North America, 38 degrees temperatures in the Arctic. All of this is occurring at 1.2 degree warming. Yet another warning that no temperature increase is safe and is deadly for many. And the reality is that for many countries in the global south, they're already being overwhelmed and their ability to respond is being diminished. Yet last month, the leaders of the world's biggest economies and those most responsible for causing the climate crisis met at the G7. And despite the years of promises and made at countless summits that we're heading towards, that we're in a climate emergency, we are currently heading towards a catastrophic warming of the planet of at least 3 degrees, if not more. And that, of course, threatens the existence of many of our fellow citizens across the world. So the richest countries are not only failing to do their fair share, as set out in the Paris Agreement, to prevent this breach of the 1.5 degree guardrail, but even those inadequate plans that are in place continue to bank on unproven, risky and non-existing technologies to suck out hundreds of billions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere. The net zero mantra has literally become a license to be able to continue to pollute. And if we're looking at that carbon budget for 1.5, the reality is it means decarbonisation in the global north by 2030, so that the poor have some room to be able to breathe and be able to cut their emissions by 2050. We are, as all of us know, living in decade zero, where every decision we make will determine who lives, who dies, whose lives matter, and who is sacrificed. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights said, we're entering an era of climate apartheid. But it's not only emissions. The IPCC said we need at least 1.5 trillion to meet in financial flows to meet the 1.5 degree goal. Others estimate a global need of at least a financial flow of up to $1 trillion a year for the next decade. It sounds a lot, yet contrast that first with the unmet promise from a decade ago to provide 100 billion a year to the close to 13 trillion that is being spent mainly in the global north on the COVID response, or the 16 trillion that has flowed in financial flows from the south to the north since 1980 alone, or the 4.5 trillion in debt repayments, let alone the trillions that have been sucked out from the south during colonialism today. Even today, the reality is that for every $1 that flows in aid, 24 flow in on the opposite direction. It literally is that the South is developing the global North. And we could give you a chapter and verse also about inequality, about half the world still struggling to survive on less than the equivalent of $5.50, half the world without access to electricity or clean cooking, 2 billion people facing issues of hunger, lacking housing, health, education. global inequality isn't getting better, it's actually getting worse. And I'm sure my colleague Paola will undoubtedly speak about the situation of workers around the world, but hundreds of millions of jobs have already been lost, hundreds of millions more are already at risk, and already hard-won rights are being rolled back in the name of the recovery. So what hope is there? So in the global north, we've seen governments and institutions such as the IMF today shaping policy discussions around Build Back Better and visions of Green New Deals that would herald a green transition that they say would address both the climate crisis and the crisis of economic inequality. But the reality is these mainly continue to be limited to the global north, and all of them are prefaced on a new wave of extraction of resources and exploitation, but this time in the name of the green recovery. The OECD estimates that we're going to double our current resource use globally, with huge environmental injustices and human rights violations for the poor, simply so that the richest can continue unsustainable consumption. So how do we address all of these crises together and not in silos? Well, we've been working on 4 tests. We say, first of all, does our plan commit to limiting temperatures to below 1.5 degrees through a fair share response? Does it tackle economic inequality? Does it put well-being ahead of sustainable growth and extraction of resources? But also, does it undo the embedded systems of injustice, the racism, the patriarchy, the racialized capitalism that are so embedded into our global economic and political systems? And if you start at those 4 tests, then you begin to see demands that meet those tests. So that goes beyond us calling simply for renewable energy to actually making demands that food and energy should be a fundamental right for all, under democratic control, equitably shared, and not exploited for corporate profit. It's about ensuring that everyone, no matter where they are in the world, has a right to a living wage, to social protection and free and universal services, where the technologies that are needed for this justice transition are not subject to the same barriers of TRIPS and unfair trade rules and corporate controls that we've seen with the COVID vaccine, and where the financial flows are commensurate with the need and without the conditionalities. And we can do that through global wealth taxes, corporate taxes, and of course, ending the forced privatization. And the frameworks and the institutions. Well, I think it's a long time since we moved past the discredited institutions of the IMF, the World Bank and the WTO, and we actually start looking at what is the framework for a genuine global cooperation, one that can not simply suspend or restructure global debt, but actually cancel it. I have friends, this very short time, I think we have this incredible opportunity at this moment. There is a window that exists for us to actively and consciously uproot these unjust systems, and for us to champion a vision of a genuine just transition for all. That's why we as War on One, together with many of our partners all around the world, are calling for a global Green New Deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Asad. I know you've covered an awful lot in a very short period of time, but we are coming back to a Q&A at the end of our panel session. Thanks again, Asad. Paola, would you like to kick off?
Yes, just a second. I'll just have. Sorry, could you give me 2 seconds? Sorry.
That's no problem at all. While Paola is doing that, I'd like to say thanks to people who are putting into questions into Mentimeter. I am looking at that. I see that you're rating them as well, which is very useful. And maybe also just to point out, some of them are relevant to specific Irish policy issues. It is not the case that we want to ignore them for a second, but we are in the second half of the conference, we will have Irish civil society speakers who will be speaking to some of these issues in breakout rooms. So please keep that in mind. Are you okay, Paola?
Yeah, Jerry, sorry. I just lost the screen for a second. Sorry. It happens during those days of virtual meetings. So first of all, thanks a lot again, Jerry, and all the friends and the participants for this important event. It's really a pleasure for me to be with you and representing the international global labor movement. So I would like to share with you a few consideration and food for thoughts for a lively exchange in the next sessions, because first of all, I would like also to share with you some views and data on the crisis impact on the world of work. Because COVID-19 has triggered an extraordinary wave of destruction across the world of work. The International Labour Organization estimates that over 250 million jobs have been destroyed, and more than 1.6 billion informal workers are facing deprivation. The number of workers living in moderate or extreme poverty increased by 108 million in 2020, thus reversing 5 years of continuous progress. But actually, if we look at how the world entered the crisis, we know that the world entered the crisis already with a sustainability debt, so to speak. So we have actually built what we have called an SDG 8 global monitor, the ITUC SDG 8 global monitor, that actually shows that the lack of adequate wages, the lack of inclusive labor markets are still major questions hindering the well-being for all and employment quality. Workers' exposure to risk, underprotection, and exclusion are still global challenges. And why only wealthier countries seem to perform or to do better concerning the labor rights protection, the economic crisis brought along restriction on freedom on labor rights violation worldwide, so developing and industrialized economies. So this includes, for example, international labor standards violation, non-compliance with labor regulation regarding layoff, working hours and wage payment, and disregard of health and safety regulations. Therefore, it's not a surprise that the pre-existing labor market deficiencies resulted in making those who are most vulnerable even more exposed to the impact of the crisis. So to name a few, the low-skilled workers, migrant workers, informal workers, and women and youth. And when talking about women, it's really, scary because, of course, women got disproportionately affected by the crisis. Globally, employment losses for women stand at 5% versus 3.9% for men. And then additionally, 90% of women who lost their jobs in 2020 exit the labor force. So this means that it will be extraordinarily difficult for them to come back into the labor market. So they really face long-lasting exclusion in that sense. So as the minister said, it's really imperative to really push forward a human-centered recovery to get out of this crisis. And the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are helping us in this respect because they show the path toward resilience and just societies. In particular, through its target on decent work, social protection, and sustainable growth, SDG 8 plays a fundamental role in providing these policy responses to the crisis, and I will explain how in a minute. So, what are the main challenges at the moment at the horizon? So, we would say divergent recoveries and weakened employment landscape. The response and measures taken to respond to the needs of the damages caused by the pandemic has been actually very uneven, because with high-income countries spending heavily on their pandemic responses, we actually saw countries that are less have less means not to be able to keep the pace. So we have stimulus spending per capita average nearly $10,000 in the developed countries, while it amounted to less than $20 per capita in the least developed countries. So the difference is really huge. So when we talk about the employment, the globally projected employment in 2021 is still falling short of its pre-crisis level, and unemployment is foreseen to be high everywhere in 2022, but with middle-income countries being most affected. So really, divergent recoveries, particularly exacerbated by the absence of, as Asad said, of strong international cooperation to beat the pandemic everywhere, and this, really challenging, weakened scenario about employment are the biggest challenge. And in order to respond to that, we know that governments are really tempted to go back to austerity, in order to face and to tackle the debt sustainability concerns that they have. But this we know that it will be devastating, in terms of cuts in social sector spending, and devastating in terms of making up the speed towards a quality recovery and a quality resilience that we all need. And therefore, it's really crucial now that policymakers prioritize both urgent measures, as the minister was referring to, but also to long-term recovery measures. Indeed, in line with the SDGs and SDG 8 in particular from the trade union perspective. And what are these measures? So I'll try to summarize this in 5 quick points. The first one, stepping up investment in decent and climate-friendly job creation with just transition measures. The minister already referred very well and very eloquently to those. Millions of jobs can be created through investment in sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, and energy efficiency measures. But to guarantee that workers and community are not left behind, just transition measures must be negotiated with social partners and rooted in social protection, education, training, and skills development. Second point, scaling up universal social protection systems. This is, although feasible options for many countries where only political will is really the real determinant, this is not the case for the poorest country. So the UN Special Rapporteur's proposal on extreme poverty and human rights for the establishment of a global fund for social protection is crucial to upholding the implementation of social protection floors in the poorest countries, and therefore build resilience for their population. Third point, upholding equality and fight vulnerability. I referred before to the devastating impact on women, therefore investment in quality public care services and infrastructure will be crucial, with the promotion of equal pay for work of equal value, as our ILO conventions would say, and the introduction of a minimum living wages with strong collective bargaining remain really the precondition to gender equality. But also, of course, education and lifelong learning when we think about our young and youth in the labor market, entering the labor market. The fourth point is really on financing recovery and resilience, because of course policies are meaningless if they are not supported and accompanied by really concrete resources and allocation, financial allocation to support that. First and foremost, I would like to also to join Asad appeal in really demanding universal access to vaccine and treatment. This is not only a moral, a moral need, but also, it's really fundamental in order to for the economy to reboost the economy, but also increased level of ODA, of official development assistance. With this big injection of liquidity, we, countries must and keep their commitment on ODA and concessional finance with the multilateral development banks, having, and prioritize employment, quality employment creation. And then finally, last but not least, supporting inclusive governance and social dialogue. We say that social dialogue and industrial relations are key in crafting equitable policies and granting really greater level of transparency, of good governance, and also trust in institutions within countries, but also across nations. So all in all, to conclude, we really think that the world needs a new vision to refound the economic and societal models nowadays. And this requires commitments from all economic, social, and political forces. The SDGs and SDG 8 provide us with these visions and related policy. So these 5 priorities that I just mentioned are really at the heart of the trade union's demand of what we call a new social contract to address the major deficit in the world of work and also to ensure a human-centered recovery and resilience. So, Jerry, I'll stop here and I will be happy to address any possible question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paola. I really appreciate it. It's great to have the trade union perspective and you're placing it in the context of SDG 8, and your 5 recommendations are really useful. I might now pass over to Dr. Ryan if he can kick off our final panel discussion. You're very welcome.
Can you see me and hear me? Yeah, thanks, Jay.
And indeed.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Great to see you all, and very interesting listening to Paola and to Asad, and I very much agree with your sentiments. And thank you so much for organizing this meeting. And I was reflecting a little on the concept of a just recovery, and that sense of a recovery with justice. But I was looking at the definitions of what recovery means. As a medic, we look at recovery in our patient, and that's seen as a return to a normal state of health, mind, or strength. And we all want that. But that's assuming that it was normal to start with. Unfortunately, what are we recovering to a previous state of injustice? But I also looked at another definition of recovery, which is not in my medical world, and that is the action or process of regaining possession or control of something that has been stolen or lost, which is another way of looking at the idea of recovery, to recover something. And I think we have lost something, not just recovering from the insult of a pandemic, both to our health, to our mental health and well-being, to our social health, to our economic health, to and everything else. But in a sense, something that we need to recover that has been lost too, which is our sense of cohesion and solidarity and connectedness. And what we've, I think, Asad, you referred to, what we've really failed to do to show even the most smallest modicum of solidarity in the face of a tremendous inequity that has really been the hallmark of this pandemic. We've seen a pandemic of a virus, a small microbe, but we've seen also a real pandemic of self-interest, a pandemic of really not being able to see beyond the end of our noses, not being able to see a future. When we talk about a planet, you were speaking about as a planet that's out of balance, a biome that's out of balance, society out of balance, we're suffering. This microbe has exploited all of those existing frailties in our system, economic, social injustices, health injustices that have existed for years. This virus is not what's actually killing people. The virus is killing people in the sense that most people are dying from from having very severe inflammatory responses in their lungs from the presence of the virus. The virus itself is not killing the people. What's killing them is the underlying conditions that lead them to not be able to tolerate or be able to survive the infection. And that's diabetes, hypertension, existing lung disease, lack of management, lack of access to healthcare for years, lack of health protection, lack of health promotion. And that's why we're losing so many people. We're losing so many people because the health and well-being of our population has not been strong enough, because we have not protected that. We have not built resilient mental health, and we're suffering for that now, and we're suffering in all that. So we've lacked resilience across all parts of our society because we haven't invested in that resilience. We haven't invested in solidarity. We haven't invested in caring or giving a damn about each other. We've isolated our societies into nice units of production, the individual on a treadmill, producing for fear of losing. And that is the society we've created, and not one that does well in a pandemic, not one that can come together quickly to find solutions. We have found scientific solutions, thankfully, and we have them. And the tragedy of the moment is we have developed scientific solutions for this pandemic faster than with any other time in the past. And we have the money, the means, and the science, but we lack the will to share them to save the lives we need to save. So it's almost a greater tragedy, because if we couldn't find the bloody vaccine, then we couldn't find it. No one had it. But the very fact that we have the technology to develop it and save those lives, and we don't share, is to me almost it's a greater insult to my mind. It's a greater insult to my sense of humanity. And that really speaks across the whole. I know that there are many other issues you want to discuss. Vaccine equity is huge because it's just an example of where we are. But those inequalities go right across the system. As I said, underlying health conditions unmanaged, lack of access to healthcare, lack of universal health coverage, people having to now pay and compete for healthcare in the face of a pandemic. Very, very hard to witness. And yet we've seen the most wonderful behaviors of our communities, people, solidarity, our frontline health workers, the people who work in the shops and the post offices, the people who kept going to work to keep our services running, the workers. And I give a shout out to the workers of the world, Paola, not just health workers. Really,
it's 5 to 5.
Sorry, I'm just going to mute everyone, and that'll mean, Michael, that you'll have to unmute yourself in a second.
Okay. All right. So sorry, I was just giving a shout out to Paul and the workers of the world, because I think people probably don't realize the extent to which our health workers are, they're my heroes anyway, but there are so many other workers who've gone out there day after day and night after night and kept this planet moving and kept services moving, and they deserve our huge gratitude for everyone, for all those people who've stayed home and minded their kids. We've seen some wonderful actions, some wonderful community solidarity, the people who set up food banks. It's not all bad. We've seen something very precious about our willingness to cooperate and work for each other. But we've also seen venal greed. We've seen isolationism, populism, othering of everything. So the best and the worst, and it's always the same in a crisis, isn't it? You see the best, you see the worst. The question for us when we talk about this issue is a recovery. What do we want? The old normal, something new? And what are we promising our children? Because we have the issues of health justice, social justice, climate justice. They're coming together. These things are converging. They're becoming the same thing because one is affecting the other. Social equity is affecting how we do in pandemics. It's affecting how we're dealing with climate. Climate is affecting social equity. Climate is affecting the potential for health crises. They're wrapped around each other now. They've become intertwined as threats, and we can't deal with them separately anymore. You can't separate them and say, we'll deal with this, and then we'll deal with that, and then we'll deal with the other thing. We can't do that. So how are we going to address this? This is a very complex issue, and complex things don't often have simple answers. But it's conversations like this, and it's really getting back to, and the Just Recovery movement is great because I love some of the themes in there, because it's not all the high tech it's not all about the high tech solutions. It's really about learning the lessons from this pandemic in terms of public services. Going back through the Just Recovery, people, communities, inclusive and participatory approaches, fast and fair action. That's what Just Recovery is about. Now, that has to turn into something real. But they're not the words I'm hearing in other sources. I mean, they're the team, that's the DNA of a Just Recovery. But they're not the words that certainly governments or others are not necessarily wanting to hear about. Empowering communities, solidarity, people-centered approaches, a focus on public and common services, fast and fair action, stronger governance, more transparency, better trust. These are the things that will build solutions for the three big threats that I see. I'm not so sure we have the governance systems in place that pay adequate respect to those sort of approaches. And I think it's important that communities and societies activate. This isn't about politics. This is about survival. And this is what we're really talking about. You're talking about the sustainable development goals. Sometimes that's seen as something we need to get better than we are now. You know, we need to move forward because we're in a great place and we need to get to a better place. And there are elements of the SDGs we're achieving, but the SDGs is becoming less about development and more about survival. Maybe we should call them sustainable survival goals, because many of the issues in the SDGs, if they're not achieved, we're going to a very, very bad place. So this isn't just about development anymore. This is really about survival of our civilization, of a way of life. Because as these risks converge and as they drive social unrest and conflict, we'll have water wars and virus wars and not the wars of the past. I'm very glad to be here. The pandemic continues to rage. The decoupling of this pandemic, and it's now really turned into a two-tier pandemic. The North, and to use the soccer term, I don't know if there are any soccer fans out there, they think it's all over. We're out of it, vaccines, and we'll take our chances after this. What people aren't recognizing is more than half the world is still on the edge of the next precipice, the next cliff in this pandemic, and about to experience another major wave of disease without the protection of vaccines. There are 85 doses of vaccine per 100 people in developed high-income countries, probably translating to about an average of 40% vaccine coverage. In low-income countries, that's 1.3 per 100. That's less than half of 1% vaccination coverage with 2 doses in low-income countries. We wanted to take the death and the suffering out of this pandemic. We have the means and had the means to do that, to protect the vulnerable, older persons and frontline workers. They're the people who have died in this pandemic. They're the people who really have died in huge numbers. And we had enough and have enough vaccine to protect each and every single one of those on this planet today. It exists. But now we're talking about booster vaccines in the developed world. That's the conversation today. Go and look at it on Twitter, see what's trending. Go and look at the main news channels. That's what's trending. That's going to be the conversation on the major news media, because I'm sitting here getting these questions all day today. What's my opinion on booster doses? No one's asking me what's my damned opinion on the fact that there are people dying all over the world that don't need to die. No one's asking me about health workers who are going to work today in isolation wards all over the world, in the developing world, without being vaccinated, risking their lives today. I'm being asked, what do I think about booster doses for people in developed countries? I'm sorry to be angry and emotional, but you know what? Sometimes it gets very hard to take. It really gets very hard to take. So I'm really glad to be with you, fellow travelers, in thinking about Just Recovery. But you know what? It's not just now about Just Recovery. I'm sorry, we have a real battle on our hands today, right now. It's about a just response. We do not have a just response. If we don't get a just response, we will not get a just recovery. So let us maybe show that we want just recovery, we want the SDGs, but we demonstrate our commitment to that by forcing the issue about a just response. Because this is about as unjust a response to a major crisis as I have ever seen in my whole career. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Fantastic. I think we'd all be clapping now if we weren't all on mute, which is our fault. But look, thank you so much for bringing the focus back to the need for a just response, and your comment that it's no longer just about sustainable development goals; they're survival goals. It couldn't be more relevant. I want to lead a panel discussion now with you. Unfortunately, I have 30 questions and we have about 20 minutes, which means I have to be the bad person and try and group questions together. So what I might do, I've made a few notes here and tried to group a few of them. And I might, Asad, I might kick off with yourself, but Paola and Michael, please do come in. There's a number of questions, Asad, on questioning capitalism and patriarchy at the moment. The impact of corporations, the financialization and automation of the economy, the need for degrowth, essentially that, very broadly speaking, that we don't have a human-centered economy or system at the moment. I don't know, do you want to expand on any of that? And I know this, like War on Want has been very much focused on the importance of a Green Deal. But in terms of the fundamental weaknesses in our economy, would you like to speak to some of those themes?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. And I look, we're living in a moment where even some of our language is being co-opted, right? So you've got some iterations of the Build Back Better, which I really say is build back the same, or even build back worse. That's what they're intent on doing, right? We saw after the G7, the moment of multiple crises, a plan to develop a plan to not do anything, to fundamentally not alter our economic model. And everybody can see that our economic model is broken. It's just not sustainable. It's denying the majority of people in the world the right to live with dignity. It's failing and leading to extreme inequality and injustices, where it's unsustainable and consumption on a finite planet, huge environmental damage, and of course damage to communities. So talking about just recoveries, but failing to actually take on the tough question about what is the economy for, and asking ourselves what economic model we want, it's simply, I think we're just deluding ourselves, right? That's why we say, look, you can't have these green recoveries just in the global north in individual countries. Progressive people can't retreat back to the nation state and talk about what kind of recovery we want at a national level. Of course, that's important. If we're not also talking about what do we do about a trade system, what do we do about a global economic system, what do we do about taxation, what do we do about the fact that the reason why there are no health systems in many countries in the global south is because our policies, our structural adjustment programs, our policies at the IMF and the World Bank told and forced countries to privatize their public services. And even today, in the IMF loans that are given to the global south to deal with the pandemic, it's written in, as Paola said, that once the pandemic is over, they will have to cut their vital public services because to meet their debt repayments. This is a broken world with a broken economy. No rebranding of capitalism as green capitalism is going to solve it. We have to be brave. And I think often as progressive people, we feel like a little bit afraid to say that out in public. We're happy to say it internally within organizations. We're happy to say it when we have conversations, but we're not able to speak out. And I think now is the moment for all of us in terms of the progressive communities to actually be much more vocal about that, to be talking about that this isn't the economic model that we want. And unless we do that and center our recoveries to be able to do that, I think we're going to be wasting years, and the clock is ticking. As Michael said, it's not that we're just at the crossroads of humanity, right? We're on the edge of the precipice already, and we're just continuing to hurl ourselves over it. And yes, there may be parts of the global north that may very well, be able to recover and sustain itself, but literally at the expense of not just millions, but hundreds of millions, if not billions of people being displaced, losing their lives and livelihoods. You look at all of the projections that are written into the IPCC's report about 1.5. Look at all of the ILO and the ITC reports on what's happening to income inequality and workers. here in the global north, I don't know if people remember, I don't know if it was a thing in Ireland, but in the UK last summer, there were people tweeting pictures about nature is recovering, right? And saying, isn't it great during the pandemic and the lockdown, nature is recovering. And yet in India, we had people, walking thousands of kilometers, left destitute as multinationals shut their gates. We had the dead lying unburied in Ecuador, right? We had health systems absolutely overwhelmed. This is not a individual policy issue. This is a structural policy. And that, I could say, is part of my critique of the SDGs, right? That the goals are all great, but it fails to actually address the economic model. And unless you talk about both the economic model and the resources that are needed to transform that, we will simply be still talking about the goal and unmet goals in the future.
Thank you, Asad. Did you want to come in, or go ahead?
Yeah, there are very interesting questions and tough questions, I would say. So I will give it a go. Of course, I'll follow up from the last word from Asad on the economic model, which we completely agree. We say that the current economic model is broken, and we really need to revise it, to have it a more, human-centered approach, and then I can elaborate more on that. But I also think that the SDGs, the beauty of the SDGs and the value of that is that they propose policies, and policies need to be then implemented. And in that sense, we are convinced that the SDGs can actually show the path and the way towards sustainability, and in that case, show the way on how recovery should be pushed, and the resilience, how resilience should be built. For example, on climate, GoLate in itself says decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation. And this is a clear policy that everybody is deemed to implement then and to put in place. And this is why we very much value that, because without implementing, you cannot have a human-centered approach if you don't have just transition measures that actually can accompany, the transition of workers when there are technological or climate shifts. So, and just transition measures, what are there? Social protection. We see that countries that have a stronger social protection system, and actually Dr. Ryan said it very well, public service, the coverage of health coverage, universal of people, they are the countries that are coping actually better now with the pandemic. And this is the huge difference that I was mentioning before between developed and developing countries. So these are the issues that I think the SDGs are very well, spotting, and they were actually, I think, built up and thought through in 2015, but very, very, very much pertinent now in these circumstances where the crisis, unfortunately, is hitting us very well. And then let me conclude that I cannot agree more with Dr. Ryan about, the reading that he's actually shared about this difference, huge, actually shameful difference, between developed and developing countries in the capacity to cope with the crisis, and this is something that it really should be redressed immediately by the international community. I'll stop here. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Paola. Just to pick up on another of the questions, you actually mentioned yourself there what specific measures are needed, particularly specific measures needed for those, be it on the lower incomes or those who have lost their jobs. And one of the questions is, does a just transition suggest the need for a universal basic income to offset widespread poverty and homelessness? I don't know, either Paola or any of the panelists, would they like to address this question of the need for universal basic income or any other specific policy measure that they envisage is necessary?
I'm just going to butt in for a second. I'm going to mute everyone again. Can all the participants please try to make sure that you're on mute, and the panelists will have to unmute yourself.
No problem. Bit of suspense there. Yeah, it's on that universal basic income question or on other specific measures. Did any of you have views?
I do. I was waiting for Paola to go first.
No, I just spoke, so I was waiting. It's okay. Go ahead, Asad. Go ahead.
Well, look. Of course, there's a raft of measures, and as Michael said, you know, what's really fascinating about when you look at every crisis, right? You look at what the response is needed, and you find that the same response is needed. If you want to talk about building resilience of people in the face of the climate crisis, you know, what are the most important measures for them? It's public services. It's a living wage. It's social protection. It's the right to housing and health and education. What do you need to tackle inequality? It's exactly the same things. What are they needed to tackle the COVID pandemic? It's exactly the same thing. What is it that people need to live with dignity? It's the same thing. So we are seeing sets of demands that do come. So whether we talk about a guaranteed basic income or, you know, minimum income in countries, there has to be a guaranteed living wage, right, for people. Absolutely. We have to recognize the reality that 60% of the global south is in the informal economy, right? So of course we need, right, we need to protect, and that's why we all call for there needs to be workers' rights and you know, living wages. But we also have to recognize that yes, there are people in the informal economy. That's why you need social protection. That's what social protection is about. That's, you don't, the basic income, for me, the worry about the basic income is it doesn't then open the argument saying, well, you don't need any public services, right? Because you've got a basic income. Now it's up to you. It's about you as an individual, rather than us talking about how are we collectively safeguarding everybody within our communities and within our societies. And so I look for more sort of universal policies such as public services, living wages, social protection, those, and guaranteeing workers' rights. You do that, you've got the right sort of framework to actually transform your economies and your societies. And we've seen that. That's what's happened in the global north. Our welfare states weren't handed to us. They were won by labor organizations. Our minimum working weeks were not handed to us. Our weekends off were not handed. These have all come through struggle because we had strong labor unions, strong workers' rights, and we demanded them. And there's a fundamental answer to all of the questions that we ask is there is an imbalance of power between those who are making decisions and the majority of people in the world. And how do we rebalance that power? How do we build our collective power? How do we become more than just the individuals? How do we build the movement to movements? And I think that's ultimately, it's true both in a national context and of course it's true in a global context.
Thanks, Asad. Paola, did you want to come in? And then I might go to a few questions for Michael afterwards.
Just quickly, I cannot agree more with Asad, of course, and you know, just to mention that you know, this the income, you know, the maternity protection, the social protection, you know, like nutrition. This, we call it, you know, the social protection floor. So meaning that, you know, they are meant to cover the people most in need. And there is actually, you know, the ILO recommendation that it's actually, you know, it was delivered precisely on that. So together with of course the ILO convention on social protection. So there are, you know, instruments at the international level within the International Labour Organization. There are standards that are actually, you know, helping member states all over the world to implement those measures and those policies. And we also say, just allow me, Jerry, to mention that, you know, I mentioned it before, in many cases, in many countries, these are political choices, you know, feasible political choices. because also resources can be found to support this kind of systems. But in many countries, in poorest countries, it's not a question of choice. It's a question that they cannot afford it. And now with the debt crisis, it's even more, so they cannot just do that. So here, when it comes the fundamental role of international solidarity, and in those times where there is this liquidity injection in order to help countries to cope with the economic recovery, it is a moral duty, it is a moral imperative to help, and to boost the official development assistance, international development cooperation, in order to put those countries in the position to protect their own people and their own population. And this is why we support very much, the ITUC supports very much the proposal of the UN Special Rapporteur on poverty and human rights on the creation of a global mechanism, a global fund to support the implementation of those social protection floors in the countries most in need. Thanks.
Thank you, Paola. I might come to Michael now. There's a particular question here, Michael, and I think it links in with some of the comments you made around the real importance now of activism. But it notes that given the focus of the SDGs to leave no one behind, and in light of the experience of COVID, how can young people specifically contribute more? And after you respond to that, Michael, I might finish off with a couple of questions on the climate, on the links with climate after that. But Michael, I don't know if you have any views on that question.
No, I mean, I wouldn't even be asking what more can young people do. Young people are the answer. So we need to mobilize youth right now because it's their planet, it's their future. They're the ones who will either inherit a planet and a biome and a civilization that's worth living in or tolerable to live in. Asad, I heard you say 3 times a very important word, and I think it's a word that young people should really consider. Young people in Ireland, given social progress made in Ireland over the last number of years, and is the word dignity. I think we forget this word. We forget the right to dignity, the dignity of work, the dignity of home, the dignity of access to healthcare without risking your financial future. We talk about human rights, and that's very important. Rights are very important, but rights tend to create people react to rights, right? They say, "Oh, you've got rights." Well, you've got to work for your right, and you end up with a left-wing, right-wing kind of polemic. But I like to speak more about dignity, because there are certain things that aren't necessarily purely about rights. They're just about the dignity of human life and what it actually means to live a human life. And to witness all of you who've worked in non-governmental organizations and work in society, you've all existed. It's not just in the developing world, it's in the developed world as well. How many people do you know in your life experience who have to live without that basic dignity? And I think young people need to consider that. Do you want to inherit a world in which basic human dignity is not guaranteed? And I think that's a conversation young people need to get involved with. And we need to mobilize youth to the greatest extent possible. You were talking about the universal living wage. We need universal access to healthcare. Healthcare is not a commodity. It's not something to be traded. Healthcare is about the preservation of health. It's one of our true and only assets. We're born, most of us, thankfully, with an innate capacity to be healthy, to be happy. And our lives either enhance or take away from that. And that is our food, our stress levels, our access to healthcare. It's everything. Everything affects health and well-being, and mental well-being in particular. And accessing healthcare in that context is not something you should have to buy. That is something that is an innate and basic human right. And we need to ensure that when we talk about universal health coverage as a core component of the SDGs, we understand what we mean. Nobody should have to impoverish themselves or impoverish their family to access healthcare. Everyone needs the dignity of access to healthcare. the dignity of work, the dignity of food, the dignity of a roof over their heads. And I would hope that we have a generation of young people who can activate themselves on that basic principle. It's not about being left, being right, being up, being down. You know, we need to change the way we think about our society. And what you said it, I said, maybe we mightn't agree on some things politically, but we need to understand what model do we want? What is the economic and social model that you want as young people? If there's young people out there, what do you want? What world do you want to live in? Because you're going to live in the world that us idiots have given you. And by God, we're a bunch of idiots. But you don't have to accept that world. You can put your hands up and say, no, we don't want your world. We don't want the world you've created because we've really messed it up. We have screwed it up. So maybe the young people need to stand up and say, no, that's not the world we want. We want to make a different world. Maybe one that is based on some more fundamental principles of human dignity. So thank you, Asad, for using the word dignity. I think it's a word that's often forgotten in this discourse.
Thank you, Michael. Speaking of both mobilization and the importance of dignity and the importance of youth, is this issue of the links between the pandemic and climate change. There is a question there. I'm going to address this very briefly around the issue of a significantly increasing number of the herd in Ireland and the impact that that has on both emissions and on pollution in Ireland. That is, the issue of climate action is something that Friends of the Earth is extremely active on. All I'll say for the moment is that there is, as Yvonne mentioned earlier, a climate act going through the Oireachtas today and should be finalised by this week, which will introduce new targets, which they're not sufficient, but they will ensure much increased climate action, number one. And number two, it's particularly clear from both the climate and biodiversity perspective that the increases in the herd can't simply continue as they have been. But our colleagues, Sive O'Neill and Una Duggan, will address that issue in more detail in their breakout session. But I just wanted to address that because it's one of the most popular questions. Just to finish off, I might ask each of you to address this issue of the links between the pandemic and the climate emergency. We have questions here on what would the emergency response for climate look like if we treated it like the response to the pandemic? What economic model do the panel believe is most compatible with climate justice? I know you've already touched on some of these issues previously, but if you would like to respond to that and also provide any final comments as well, that'd be excellent.
Paola, I'm going to look to you first because I feel like I've spoken too much.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's just I think we have touched already on the issue, but I mean, just to recall that also the stimulus. I mean, also to note that the stimulus that have been actually provided for the recovery are still very much linked to fossil fuels, industries. So I mean, it's really something that it's really very, very a today challenge also in that respect. So I think that there we really need a shift, a new model for production, for consumption, and the SDGs are very, very clear about that in terms of policy formulation. So I think that I also was noticing a question about the role of business, and I think it's worth mentioning that because sustainability, environmental sustainability, but also social sustainability with the due diligence, and actually the European Union is actually forging a new directive in that respect on the due diligence, will be crucial in changing the model also to do business in that sense. Just also to recall that as Asad said, he mentioned that the taxation, also the G7 has actually made an important step forward when we talk about the taxation with the minimum global tax rate for multinational corporations. That, of course, it's not ideal. This is not what we actually demanded as trade unions, but of course, it's a positive step forward. So this is again linking, the taxation, the climate, and the labor all together, because of course this has to be a coherent approach in terms of shifting priorities and shifting the economic models that we want to see. Thanks.
Thank you, Paola. Asad, do you want to come in?
Sure, I'm happy to go next. Just on the question about the corona response to the climate response. I mean, if we see, and some people say, oh, well, corona's been the curtain raiser, right, on the climate response. Here's a global crisis, an issue of global that affects all of us. You have the mantra, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And right from the beginning, we had rich countries compete with poor countries for PPE equipment. Poorer countries saying we need urgent help. Rich countries saying, I'm sorry, we're looking after our own economies, turning their back. When they did finally start to say, okay, now what do you need? We've seen debt creating loans, etc. And as I said, the fact that logically, it's an incredible thing, isn't it? That we all know that we're in a race against the coronavirus mutating, and that for our own well-being of the global North citizens, it makes sense to vaccinate absolutely everybody in the world as fast as possible, right? And yet, WHO called for 12 billion vaccine doses. We got 670 million in charitable and voluntary doses, right? We've seen rich countries say, actually, the most important thing is to protect the big pharmaceutical companies and their profits, even though many of the vaccines have been made and by public money, by public research, by our taxpayer money, right? Overwhelmingly, the majority of people in every country in the global North are saying, we want those vaccines to be made available. We want the treatments to be made available to everybody equitably. And yet we still haven't changed that. And if that shows you how they're responding to this crisis, then the response to the climate crisis, where already policymakers in the global North calculate. I was at the UNFCCC and the UN climate talks for about 15 years. And I tell you, policymakers in the global North work out and say, well, maybe we can adapt to 2 degrees. Maybe we'll be able to adapt to 2.5 degrees. We know that will be a death sentence, but because that will be least economic disruption to our economies, right? So this idea, this thinking, I think, is so deep in what shapes global climate diplomacy as well as global diplomacy. Now, that, of course, is the horrible element in terms of it, but also I wanted to say that there are also real positives, right? I mean, the fact that we were able to unite everybody from the WHO to trade unions to health campaigners to climate campaigners, etc., all coming together and making one voice for a people's vaccine. When you see young people out on the street, from the climate strikers to Black Lives Matter, how they've changed the national conversations in every single country, right? I mean, I've worked in environmental organizations. I would say, the reality is the conversation about 1.5 in urgency has been driven more by young people in the last few years than have been many years of campaigning by global North environmental NGOs, because they were more interested in terms of what's being pragmatic in terms of policy demands, rather than being visionary about what is needed. So I want to just end by saying this. I think neoliberalism's greatest crime or greatest victory has been taking away our imagination, right? Taking away our ability to think that there was something before neoliberalism or there could be something after neoliberalism, right? It's an economic model that we constructed, and it's one model that can be deconstructed. So I want to end with a quote from somebody I vehemently oppose, which is Milton Friedman, who was the architect of neoliberalism, and who said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And it's up to us to make sure it's our ideas, that they're bold, that they're ambitious, and they truly meet these multiple crises.
Thank you. Michael, do you have any final words?
Well, I usually don't say this, but Asad, you're a hard act to follow. So it's hard to top that. Very hard to top that as a summary. And I won't even try. But I will say, when you spoke about the climate and the pandemic threat, and we obviously we spoke about the urgency needed, and Paola and Asad outlined that issue and the issue of the economic models. I won't go there because I agree with their views. But the reality is that climate stress and climate change is driving epidemic and pandemic risk directly and indirectly. Drought stress, changes in rainfall, temperature patterns, humidity patterns, they're driving direct changes in our biome. They're changing. I mean, it's affecting us. It's affecting the whole biome. It's affecting the whole biologic system on the planet. We are a complex biologic ecosystem sitting on a piece of rock orbiting the sun, and our climate is in active change. So it's changing the whole biome. But not only that, the indirect impact is that it's driving migration, it's driving urbanization, and it's driving all those other things that are increasing the risk of epidemics because we don't have the services in place. So we're driving the epidemic and pandemic risks associated with climate change directly and indirectly. And this is pandemics and high impact epidemics are going to be a feature of a changed planet. It's not just going to be the more people out of work. It's not just going to be the drought stress and the heat waves. Pandemics and epidemics will become a ever-present feature of a biome that's out of balance. We're on a planet out of balance, and we're within a stressed biologic system. What do we expect? Did we expect anything different? And we're reaping an expected reward. This is not unpredicted. This thing didn't walk up and just take us all by surprise. We've been talking about pandemic threats for 30 years. More. It's just happened now. And unfortunately, it's not going to stop happening unless we get our biologic system back in more balance and our social systems back in more balance. And really, that's the way we deal with this. So it's not just the urgent response to this pandemic, and that's very important. And we need an urgent response to climate, but we also need an urgent response to the factors that are driving the biologic risk, not just for this pandemic, not just the response of this pandemic. Building strong and resilient health systems, giving people basic social justice, building systems that allow us to detect and prevent and reduce the risk of future pandemics will give us more stability. They will protect us in the future. And they're exactly on the same pathway as Asad said. The same things that get us climate stability, the same things that get us social stability will get us pandemic stability. It's exactly the same investments: equity, access, dignity. Those same solidarity, sharing. It's the science we can work out. We've proven it. We can stick people on the moon and we can make all of these super vaccines. We've become really good at technology. We're really bad at sociology. We're really bad at operating as individuals with each other, as communities with each other. So we're cracking the technological challenges. We're just not cracking the social and economic challenges, and that's driving all of these other risks, for which there are no perfect technological solutions. Because even when we get them, when we get vaccines, brand new, state-of-the-art, leading-edge vaccine technology, and we get it and we pay for it, and you're right, Asad, that was paid for with taxpayers' money. And we get that technology and we get that vaccine production, and we simply cannot protect that 20% of people on this planet most likely to die from getting that virus. Not because we can't do it, but because we won't do it. That's the problem. We're not in a we can't situation, we're in a we won't. And then I ask the question, if we won't, then who's making that decision? Because we're saying, I will not do that. So someone is saying, we won't do that. And we have to change that. We have to change that very soon. Because if we don't change it on this, we won't change it in the long term. There's no point someone coming to me today and telling me they're going to promise me health justice in 10 years' time. Are they going to promise equity in 10 years' time? Are they going to promise stability in 10 years' time? I want it now. I want justice now for the people around the world who are likely to die with this virus. If we can prove even a modicum of justice in the distribution of vaccines, then I'll start to believe that we have some chance of delivering broader social and climate justice in future. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Michael. I have never been more confident that we need more time. I know that's a very standard way of finishing a conference, but it's very true. I would just like to thank all of you for your absolutely fantastic contributions.